The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation filled the restaurant on Broughton Street. My parents sat across from me, shoulders squared, eyes sharp with a secret already decided. My father leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk. "Tomorrow we're moving into your apartment. No excuses." The words slid across the table like a blade. My mother nodded, satisfied. To their left, my sister Lena raised her glass, her boyfriend smirking beside her as if they had already unpacked their boxes in my living room. I set my fork down and folded my napkin slowly. Not because I was calm, but because I had trained myself to appear that way. My name is Allara Witmore. I'm 30 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the daughter expected to manage everything, the one who held things together while Lena was celebrated for falling apart beautifully. But I am no longer the girl patching leaks and shelving second-hand books. I built a health tech startup from sleepless nights and diner coffee, wrote code until my hands shook, and learned that survival could be turned into strategy. That apartment they thought they could claim. It wasn't just an address. It was the first key that belonged only to me. The deed signed with no one else's name. The one place where silence didn't mean punishment, but peace. I watched Lena lean closer to Brian, whispering like victory was hers. My parents expected me to argue, to crumble, to yield like always. Instead, I let the pause settle until even the waiter hesitated near the table. "That's fine," I said evenly. "Just bring $860,000 by morning." Their faces drained of color, and the table stilled, long before that lunch in Savannah. I had already learned what it meant to stand in the background. Lena was the gifted one. At least that's what my parents called her, even when her report cards were littered with C's. She could stumble through a piano recital and still be applauded for her creativity. I could bring home straight A's and be told I was reliable, as though my achievements were just proof that I could handle more. I remember the year she turned 16. A red convertible appeared in the driveway with a bow on top, my father proudly patting the hood as if he'd placed a crown on her head. I was 14 then, clutching a stack of thrift store books my mother had picked up for $1 a box. They told me it would toughen me to read what others had discarded. That word tough became my inheritance. Tough enough to walk to school while Lena drove past, music blaring. Tough enough to cook dinner when my parents stayed late at gallery openings. Tough enough to patch the leaky sink while she laughed with friends in the backyard. Whenever I asked why, the answer was the same. Lena needed support. I could manage. It was a strange kind of love, the kind that kept me busy instead of safe. I learned to carry groceries in silence with the same practiced hands. When Lena borrowed the money I earned babysitting, I knew it wouldn't return. When I asked, she called me stingy, and my parents nodded along as though my protest proved her right. Somewhere in those years, resentment began to simmer quietly, like water left on low heat. I didn't shout or rebel. I simply faded into corners, learned to survive on the edges, and memorized the map of every doorway that could lead me out. That was the soil I grew from praise poured on her. Pressure pressed on me, and it shaped the woman who would one day look across a restaurant table and refuse to yield. By the time I turned 18, I thought I had found my way out. A letter from London arrived with a university crest at the top and words that made my hands tremble. Partial scholarship awarded. It wasn't full, but it was enough to make the impossible seem within reach. I carried that letter around like proof that the years in the shadows had not been wasted. For a few weeks, I let myself dream. I pictured the Thames at sunrise, libraries with shelves higher than I could touch, and a city where no one knew me only as Lena's older sister. I began collecting brochures, circling courses in economics and data science, sketching a life where my worth was measured by something other than endurance. Then the phone rang one humid afternoon, its shrill tone cutting through the house. My mother's voice was calm but heavy. Lena was in the hospital. Nothing fatal, but serious enough to bring bills my parents couldn't cover. She's too young to help, my father said when I offered the word scholarship. His voice sharpened. This time it must be you. I folded the letter into a drawer and never opened it again. London became a ghost I could only visit in silence, at night, instead of memorizing flight times. I memorized price tags. I rang up groceries under humming fluorescent lights, my apron stiff with starch, and counted coins into jars labeled tuition, rent, and survival. My parents thanked me once, briefly, as though it were an administrative duty completed. Then they shifted their attention back to Lena's new painting, hanging it in the living room as if it were a family heirloom. I stood there, arms aching from a double shift, watching them applaud her brushstrokes while my own sacrifices disappeared into thin air. Something hardened in me after that. I stopped auditioning for their praise. Instead, I opened a small savings account in my own name, depositing every extra dollar. No matter how small, I didn't tell anyone. It was the first secret I ever kept from them, a quiet rebellion disguised as practicality. I had given up London, but I wouldn't give up the idea of leaving. After London slipped away, I buried myself in what was left work and study. Days blurred into one another, classes in the morning, part-time jobs through the afternoon, and coding late into the night. My desk was littered with second-hand textbooks, notebooks full of equations, and half-drained cups of coffee that had gone cold before I ever finished them. Survival became a calculation, tuition balanced against rent, groceries weighed against bus fare. I lived inside spreadsheets, teaching myself to stretch a single paycheck into a month of meals and lab fees, while Lena posted pictures of galleries and rooftop parties. I posted nothing. I didn't have time for appearances. I was too busy keeping my head above water. It was during one of those long nights in the campus library that I met Daniel. His laptop screen flickered as he muttered at the keyboard. A pile of repair tools scattered beside him. He fixed computers for gas money, for textbooks, sometimes for food. We traded stories over vending machine coffee, the bitter taste softened by his dry humor. Where others had called me stubborn, Daniel called me relentless, and for the first time, the word didn't feel like a criticism. We studied side by side, deadlines chasing us like storm sirens. Cheap tacos became our luxury dinners. Shared earbuds filled the silence with music when words felt too heavy. He didn't pity me for the sacrifices I had made. He understood them because he was making the same ones. The Savannah startup scene was small but restless, a handful of offices tucked into historic buildings where ceilings leaked and dreams felt bigger than the rent. I joined as an intern, the youngest face in a room of mismatched desks and flickering lights. We built prototypes that looked ugly but worked, bribing testers with pizza and sheer optimism. Failure was constant, but it didn't scare me. I had failed bigger things already: dreams, scholarships, approval. This was just code. It could be rewritten. Each morning, when the city was still wrapped in fog, I walked to class with a laptop in my bag and a ledger in my mind. Sleep was a luxury I rarely touched. Progress wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, measured in lines of code. Shifts survived, and coffee cups emptied before dawn. At 27, I signed papers that felt heavier than anything I had ever held. The one-bedroom apartment in Savannah's Starland district wasn't grand by anyone else's standards. The kitchen tiles were cracked in 2 places, and the closet barely fit more than a week's worth of clothes. But when the realtor handed me the keys, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, no one else's name was on the deed. The apartment was mine, every square foot, every creak of the old floorboards, every shaft of light that poured through the east-facing window each morning. I remember standing in that light with my boxes still sealed, breathing in the scent of paint and possibility. After years of borrowed spaces and compromises, I finally had a door I could lock and know no one else had the right to open. Daniel helped me haul in furniture, mostly Craigslist finds and hand-me-downs. We laughed when the couch got stuck in the stairwell, sweating through the July heat until a neighbor offered an extra push. By the time we collapsed on the floor that night, surrounded by cardboard and pizza crusts, the apartment already felt like freedom. That feeling didn't last long. My parents insisted on touring my office at the startup where I'd earned equity. They walked the halls slowly, touching the desks, glancing at the whiteboards covered in half-legible code, but instead of pride, their questions came sharp and precise. How much are your shares worth? Now. What's the valuation? Not once did they say they were proud. Not once did they ask how I was sleeping or eating. They looked at me like an asset to be audited. Later that week, Aunt Carol called me over for coffee in her garden. She had always been softer, less rehearsed than the rest of the family. She stirred sugar into her mug before she spoke, her voice low. They're drowning. Allara, credit cards, second mortgages, Lena's studio fees. Your sister's spending money like it grows on trees. She sighed. And they're already eyeing you as the safety net. I sat there in the fading light, the scent of jasmine thick in the air, realizing that the apartment I had seen as my sanctuary might soon become their solution. The lock on my door was sturdy, but locks only hold when boundaries are respected. One evening, as I returned to my parents' house to drop off some papers Aunt Carol had asked me to deliver, I paused in the hallway outside the kitchen. Their voices carried, low but sharp enough to catch. We'll move into Allara's place, my father said, as if it were already settled. Save rent. It's only fair. The words landed heavier than any slammed door. My mother murmured agreement, and in that instant, memories rushed back with brutal clarity, babysitting money that disappeared into Lena's pockets. The scholarship I surrendered so hospital bills could be paid, the groceries rung up under fluorescent lights while she danced under confetti. I felt the same dull ache in my chest, the same reminder that in their eyes, my role had never been daughter. I was resource, fallback, plan B. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my apartment desk, laptop open, ledger pages spreading like scars across the screen. For years, I had tracked sacrifices like an accountant coins counted, dreams deferred, debts absorbed, but staring at those columns now, I realized I could add a new category, not what I owed them, but what I owed myself. A week later, I met Patrick Whitaker, a lawyer recommended quietly by one of Daniel's colleagues. He was calm, deliberate, with a way of asking questions that felt like carefully placing bricks into a foundation. Together, we sketched contingencies, a trust lock to secure my equity, no trespass clauses filed with the city, airtight agreements that transformed my savings into a fortress. He explained buyout conditions if anyone tried to claim rights to my property. The figure would stand at $860,000, not a dime less. Every document I signed felt like a stone laid into a wall I wished had been there when I was a child, when the final page was notarized. Patrick looked up and said simply, "Now you can sleep." And for the first time in weeks, I did. The ledger that once bled red now carried a different kind of line protection written in ink and law. Magnolia's Bistro was warm with the scent of garlic and fresh bread, candlelight dancing across polished silverware. I had chosen the place carefully, neutral ground with too many witnesses for anyone to raise their voice. Daniel sat beside me, steady as always, his hand brushing mine under the table. Aunt Carol lingered near the end, quiet but watchful. My father leaned forward first, his tone carrying the weight of a verdict already written. "We've decided," he said, folding his napkin neatly on his lap. "Tomorrow we're moving into your apartment. It's what families do. No excuses." My mother's smile stretched thin, as if to soften the blow, though her eyes gleamed with certainty. Across from me, Lena scrolled through her phone before setting it down with a triumphant little smirk. Her boyfriend, Brian, twirled his pasta slowly, like he was already savoring the taste of rent-free living. I set down my fork, smoothed the crease of my napkin, and let the weight of their expectation hang in the air. For years, I had filled that silence with obedience, with compromise, with sacrifice they never remembered. Tonight, I let the silence do its own work. Finally, I looked up, voice calm enough to steady the flickering candles. "That's fine," I said. "Just bring $860,000 by morning." For a beat, No one moved. Glasses hovered midair. Forks froze inches from plates. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's smile collapsed like a curtain yanked down too soon. Lena's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. Brian blinked, his fork dangling between his fingers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I simply watched the color drain from their faces, the calculation faltering in their eyes. For once, they weren't looking at me as the fallback. They were seeing the wall I had built, the gate I alone controlled. The silence at that table was louder than any accusation I had ever endured. The silence shattered under the weight of my father's voice. Selfish, he spat, his napkin hitting the table. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. My mother's voice rose, brittle and wet with false tears. Ungrateful, we sacrificed so much, and you sit here counting pennies like a stranger. Lena leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her smirk curling into a sneer. You really think you're better than us, don't you? Allara, just because you write code and bought yourself a shoebox apartment, you'll never be more than the girl we carried. Her words tried to sting, but they only pulled up memories I had carried too long. London slipping from my hands as I signed away my scholarship. Babysitting money pocketed and laughed off. Hours under the humming lights of a grocery checkout. Ringing up strangers while Lena posted her rooftop views and new shoes. My mother's thanks that lasted less than a breath before turning to applause for Lena's paintings. The list unspooled in my mind. Not bitter. Just precise like entries in the ledger I'd been keeping since I was a girl, and as each line revealed itself, something in me steadied. I looked at them without blinking, without flinching, my pulse slow and sure. The storm raged across their faces, accusations, guilt, demands, but thunder is only noise without lightning. I held the strike, and I wasn't handing it over this time. At the end of the table, Aunt Carol shifted, her lips pressed together before she gave a small nod, pride flickering in her eyes. For once, I wasn't the only one holding my ground. The table had changed shape. I wasn't beneath it anymore, carrying the weight. I was sitting level, steady, unshaken, and they were the ones scrambling to fill the silence. By the next morning, the story had already left the restaurant and spilled onto screens. Lena's posts dripped with performative heartbreak photos of her tear-streaked face, captions about betrayal, and hashtags painting me as the greedy sister who had abandoned her family. Old classmates shared her words, adding their own judgments. Some unfriended me outright. Others slid into my messages with questions I had no intention of answering. I muted the noise and went to work, but even the safety of my office didn't hold. By noon, the lobby doors banged open. My father's voice carried before I even saw him. "Where's Allara?" he boomed, red with fury. My mother trailed behind, arms waving as if every gesture was evidence. "We deserve our share," she cried, her words cutting through the hushed murmur of my co-workers. I stepped forward before anyone else could. "This is a workplace," I said, my voice low but steady. "You need to leave." They escalated, voices rising, faces tight with accusation. My cheeks burned under the weight of so many eyes. But I didn't fold. Security moved in, guiding them out as my mother's wails echoed down the corridor. "You'll regret this." "Allara," she shouted, her words bouncing off the walls. The quiet afterward felt like a wound, raw and stinging. I closed my office door and called Patrick. His calm tone landed like a stone in water. "The documents are airtight," he assured me. "They have no claim." Relief came slowly, like air after being underwater too long. That night, I scrolled through my contacts, thumb hovering over familiar numbers before pressing block. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like oxygen, rediscovered and clean. Months passed, and the storm that once felt endless began to thin. I poured my energy into the startup, long days turning into longer nights. But this time, the work didn't feel like survival. It felt like momentum. We signed new clinics, brought on 3 more developers, and filled the office with the quiet hum of people who believed in the same vision. Daniel and I married in a small park along the Savannah River, the water glinting in late afternoon sun. The ceremony was simple wildflowers in mason jars, folding chairs on soft grass, but it was ours. Aunt Carol dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with gentle sobs. When I slipped the ring onto Daniel's hand, I didn't think of what I had lost. I thought of everything we had chosen. Meanwhile, the family I once shouldered began to shrink under their own weight. My parents sold the house I grew up in, moving into a modest apartment lined with linoleum floors. Lena's feed grew quieter, her boyfriend gone, her art posts replaced by blurred snapshots of small canvases. The thunder that had once rattled me from the inside out now sounded more like a distant storm, fading across the horizon. One evening, I returned home after a late meeting, the air heavy with the smell of rain. I closed the door to my apartment and turned the key, listening as the lock clicked into place. For the first time, it didn't feel like shutting danger out. It felt like sealing peace in. The space around me was quiet, steady, entirely my own.